The Strait of Hormuz has been shut down, not threatened, not partially disrupted, shut down, for the first time in modern history. 1/5 of every barrel of oil consumed on Earth moves through a waterway 21 miles wide at its narrowest point between Iran and Oman. As of this morning, that waterway is a war zone. Over 150 tankers are anchored outside it, waiting. The insurance is pulled out. The shipping companies have turned around. And oil briefly crossed $120 a barrel before markets got word that emergency reserves might be released. But here's what the headline won't tell you. The strait being shut down is not even the most consequential thing that happened in the last 11 days. The most consequential thing is who just became Iran's new supreme leader, and what that appointment signals about how long this war is actually going to last. In the next 20 minutes, we're going to go beneath every headline that's been thrown at you this week, map exactly where this conflict stands on day 11, and show you the 3 signals in the next 7 days that will determine whether this escalates into something that reshapes the global order, or finds an off-ramp nobody's talking about yet. Stay with this. Most Americans watching this conflict understand the surface layer. The US and Israel attacked Iran. Iran is fighting back, oil prices are up, and things are tense. That's accurate, but it's about 15% of what's actually happening. Here's what the cable news cycle keeps skipping over. This is not a targeted strike campaign. This is not a repeat of 2024's limited missile exchanges or even the 12-day war of June 2027. What began on February 28th is an active, multi-theater war between the United States, Israel, and Iran, simultaneously active across Iran, Lebanon, Iraq, the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, and now touching Turkey, Qatar, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia. The scale is without precedent in this region since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Most American viewers are watching this as an Iran versus Israel story. It's not. The United States is a full co-belligerent. American aircraft, American missiles, American personnel, 7 of whom are now confirmed dead. The U.S. has struck over 3,000 targets inside Iran in 11 days. That's not air support for an ally. That is war. The media framing is largely centered on whether Iran will capitulate or negotiate. But that framing assumes Iran's decision-making structure is intact. It isn't. The killing of Supreme Leader Khamenei on day 1 didn't decapitate Iran's military capacity. It created a succession crisis inside a revolutionary system that has never navigated one of this kind before. The appointment of Mojtaba Khamenei, the slain leader's son, as the new supreme leader happened faster than almost any analyst expected. And that appointment carries enormous implications that almost no Western outlet is properly unpacking. The roots of this conflict run back decades, to 1979, to the Islamic Revolution, to decades of proxy warfare, nuclear brinkmanship, and mutual deterrence. But the direct trigger for what you're watching now was a combination of failed nuclear negotiations in Geneva, a 12-day air conflict between Iran and Israel in June 2025, and a domestic political crisis inside Iran in January 2026, when Iranian security forces killed thousands of protesters during the largest demonstrations since the Islamic Revolution. That crackdown convinced certain planners in Washington and Tel Aviv that the window for regime pressure was open, and they moved through it. And there's one specific signal we're going to get to later in this video. Mojtaba Khamenei's appointment, what his ideology means for Iran's nuclear posture, and why one analyst community's assessment of this appointment is almost directly opposite to what the official U.S. position appears to be. That gap matters enormously. Let's map the actual terrain. The primary theater is Iran itself. U.S. and Israeli aircraft have struck more than 3,000 targets across at least 26 of Iran's 31 provinces. Tehran has been the most heavily targeted, with strikes on Mehrabad International Airport, where 16 Iranian military aircraft were destroyed, oil depots, the Basij headquarters, water infrastructure on Keshem Island, and what Iranian state media reports as residential buildings, schools, and hospitals. An elementary school strike that killed at least 168 children is currently under U.S. investigation. The defense secretary has confirmed a naval base was adjacent to the school. New video contradicts earlier claims about Iranian responsibility. This is an open wound in the international community right now. In Lebanon, Israel has resumed large-scale evacuation orders in southern Lebanon and struck what it describes as a Hezbollah-controlled financial institution in Beirut's southern suburbs. Hezbollah has launched rockets into northern Israel. The Lebanon front, which had been quieter since an earlier ceasefire, is heating back up. In Iraq, the Islamic Resistance, an umbrella of Iran-aligned militias, claimed explosions in Erbil, including a drone attack targeting the U.S. consulate and Erbil International Airport. The U.S. and Israeli coalition conducted limited airstrikes targeting Iran-backed popular mobilization forces, killing at least 10. And then there are the Gulf states. This is where the picture gets complicated. Saudi Arabia intercepted 16 drones headed toward its massive Sheba oil field. Qatar's energy infrastructure was attacked, forcing a halt to LNG production at 2 major facilities. Bahrain has declared force majeure on oil. Dubai's international airport was struck by Iranian drones. The UAE and Kuwait have both reported explosions. Iran's president publicly apologized to neighboring Gulf nations and pledged to stop attacks on them. And then, hours later, the attacks continued. That gap between what Iranian leadership says publicly and what Iran's military actually does is one of the defining features of this conflict. The most significant military development of the last 72 hours is the IRGC's formal declaration that the Strait of Hormuz is closed. This is historically unprecedented. Iran has threatened this for decades. It has never actually done it. Tanker traffic has collapsed, from 70% reduction to effectively zero. Over 150 ships are anchored and waiting. Shipping giants like Maersk have suspended all crossings. The question of whether the U.S. Navy can physically reopen the strait under fire and what that operation costs in blood and money is now the central military question of the war. The U.S. has 3 carrier groups operating in the region. The USS George H. W. Bush joined the force. U.S. personnel are deployed from Saudi Arabia to Kuwait to Qatar, and diplomatic staff are being evacuated from Saudi Arabia as a precaution. On the proxy front, Houthi activity has been restrained. The group has not operated outside Yemen since October 2025. Hezbollah is active on the Lebanese front, but has not conducted mass missile salvos. The notable story is what the proxies are not doing, which suggests either degraded capability, strategic restraint, or both. And here's the detail. Most coverage is missing entirely. Iran is allowing Chinese-flagged vessels to pass through the strait. This is not a minor footnote. It is Iran explicitly signaling to Beijing, we see you as aligned, and we are protecting your equities while we fight the West. The geopolitical implications of that signal extend far beyond this conflict. If you want to understand conflicts like this before the news cycle catches up, you're already in the right place. Let's go beneath the headlines into what the signals are actually indicating. Brent crude briefly touched $119 a barrel, the highest since the Russia-Ukraine shock of 2022. This is the largest single supply disruption in the history of the oil market. As of Tuesday, prices pulled back sharply, over 10%, on anticipation of an extraordinary IEA meeting and potential coordinated release from emergency reserves. That pullback is informative. Markets believe the strait will eventually reopen. The question is the timeline and at what cost to global growth. The national average gas price for Americans has risen by nearly 50 cents per gallon in 11 days. The White House press secretary described this as a short-term disruption. Whether it remains short-term depends entirely on how quickly tanker traffic can safely resume. Open-source vessel tracking data shows traffic through the strait effectively at zero for commercial operators. Only Iranian and Chinese flagged ships are transiting. Insurers have withdrawn. The de facto closure is not a formal blockade. Iran cannot physically stop all traffic under U.S. naval pressure, but the practical effect is identical. Commercial shippers won't risk their vessels and crews in an active war zone. Qatar, one of the world's largest LNG exporters, halted production at its Ras Laffan and Mesaieed industrial cities after Iranian drone strikes. This affects roughly 12 to 14% of Europe's LNG supply. European natural gas futures jumped roughly 30% following these strikes. On the diplomatic side, there are no confirmed back channels currently operating. Iran's foreign ministry has explicitly stated it has no interest in negotiations while under attack. The U.S. position is that there will be no negotiations. The U.S. and Israel will set the terms of surrender. These are not the words of two sides looking for an off-ramp. They are the words of two sides that each believe the other will break first. And the most telling intelligence signal right now is the gap between Iran's presidential statements and Iran's military behavior. The president apologized to Gulf neighbors and pledged to stop striking them. The strikes continued within hours. This tells us one of 3 things. Either the presidency does not control the IRGC, the statement was deliberately disingenuous, or there are competing power centers inside Iran's new post-Khamenei leadership structure that have not yet resolved who controls military decision-making. All 3 possibilities are destabilizing in different ways. The quiet signal most people walked past this week is that Iran is allowing only Chinese vessels through the strait. That is a deliberate strategic message. Iran is preserving its relationship with Beijing as a long-term insurance policy, even in the middle of an existential conflict. Watch whether China responds by using this as diplomatic leverage. If Beijing starts making quiet calls to Washington, it's the first real signal of an off-ramp forming. This conflict does not exist in isolation. Russia's posture has been one of strategic observation and economic benefit. As Middle Eastern oil becomes inaccessible to Asian markets, Russia's competitive position improves dramatically. Both India and China face strong incentives to deepen reliance on Russian crude if the strait remains disrupted. This is a material benefit to Moscow without Russia firing a single shot. China is the most consequential external actor in this conflict. Beijing buys the majority of Iranian oil, sources roughly 40% of its oil imports through the strait, and has been allowed safe passage by Iran for Chinese-flagged vessels. China is materially exposed. Roughly 30% of its LNG imports come from Qatar and the UAE, but has buffers of approximately 1 billion barrels of strategic reserves. The critical question is whether China decides this conflict is damaging enough to its economic interests that it applies genuine pressure on Iran. There are no confirmed signals of that yet. Saudi Arabia has every incentive to stay out of this war militarily and every incentive to see it end quickly. The kingdom is not publicly aligned with the U.S.-Israeli campaign, but it is quietly benefiting from rising oil prices and is reportedly rerouting crude exports via its Red Sea port at Yanbu, bypassing the strait entirely. Saudi silence is tactical, not neutral. Qatar has suffered some of the most significant economic damage of any non-combatant. Its energy minister warned that if the war continues, Gulf energy producers may be forced to halt exports entirely, a development he described as something that will bring down economies of the world. The UN Security Council is effectively deadlocked. Russia and China have blocked binding resolutions. The UN Secretary General has called for an immediate ceasefire. 2 missiles have entered Turkish airspace and been shot down by NATO forces. Turkey is walking an extraordinarily difficult line, a NATO member hosting U.S. air assets at Incirlik while trying to stay out of a war it did not choose. The U.S. State Department has ordered non-emergency staff and family members to depart southeastern Turkey. Who benefits economically from prolonged instability? Russia in the short term. U.S. domestic energy producers in the medium term. But the economic damage to global growth from a prolonged Hormuz disruption would eventually feed back negatively even into U.S. economic conditions through inflation and slowed demand. Is this conflict staying regional? Not anymore. 2 NATO member states have had their territory or airspace struck. European LNG prices have surged 30%. The Dow fell over 400 points on day 2. The scale has moved beyond Middle Eastern regional conflict into something that is actively reshaping global energy markets, financial conditions, and alliance structures. Now, here's the part that changes everything about how you should be watching this. Conflict analysts use an escalation ladder to assess how close a conflict is to direct superpower involvement or civilization scale risk. Before February 28th, U.S.-Iran tensions were at roughly level 3 to 4 on a 10-point scale. Proxy competition, sanctions, and one prior 12-day air war in 2025. As of today, day 11 of a direct U.S.-Iran war with full military engagement, multiple countries under attack, and the world's most critical energy choke point closed, we are at level 7 to 8. The next escalation, a successful Iranian strike on a major Saudi oil facility, a direct strike on a U.S. carrier group, or a decision to formally mine the strait, would move us to level 9. At level 9, the risk of conflict spiraling beyond anyone's intent becomes acute. For the United States, the explicit red line was the Strait of Hormuz. That red line has essentially already been crossed. The de facto closure has already happened. The question is whether the U.S. can restore shipping without a direct naval confrontation with IRGC forces in the strait itself. For Iran, the red line may have already been crossed, the killing of the supreme leader. Iran's new leadership has every revolutionary incentive to demonstrate it is not weaker than its predecessor. The appointment of Mojtaba Khamenei, described by analysts as a hardliner, suggests the new leadership will not seek a negotiated exit that looks like defeat. There are almost no de-escalation signals present right now. The one quiet signal worth watching is China. If Beijing decides the economic damage to its supply chains is unacceptable and applies genuine diplomatic pressure on Tehran, which it is capable of doing since China is Iran's most important economic relationship, that would be the first meaningful off-ramp signal. The status of Iran's nuclear program is one of the most consequential unknowns in this conflict. The prior 12-day war in June 2025 included U.S. airstrikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. What happened to the program since then is contested. If Iran retains functional nuclear enrichment capability, the entire strategic calculus of this war changes. On the U.S. side, 7 dead soldiers, rising gas prices, and a school strike under investigation are the variables that will shape congressional and public tolerance for a prolonged campaign. The administration has framed this as a short-term operation, but has provided no timeline. The gap between short-term excursion and day 11 of a multi-theater war with no visible off-ramp is growing. On the Iranian side, the new supreme leader has enormous pressure to demonstrate he is not a figurehead placed in power by crisis. His legitimacy within the revolutionary system depends on projecting strength, which means the probability of unilateral Iranian de-escalation is very low in the near term. The last time we saw a similar combination of a decapitated adversary state leadership structure, active energy infrastructure warfare, and a declared but functionally contested maritime closure was the 1980-1988 Iran-Iraq War, specifically the tanker war phase, beginning around 1984. In that period, Iranian and Iraqi forces systematically attacked tankers and oil infrastructure. The U.S. eventually intervened militarily to escort Kuwaiti tankers, and the conflict became a grinding attrition war that neither side fully controlled. The key difference today? The U.S. is not an escorting neutral. It is a full co-belligerent. That changes every calculation. History doesn't repeat, but the patterns of miscalculation do. And right now, the pattern is loud. This level of analysis doesn't come from headlines. It comes from watching the signals most people walk past. To understand what's happening right now, you need two historical reference points. 11 months ago, in June 2025, the U.S. and Israel conducted a 12-day air campaign against Iran that included strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. That conflict ended in a ceasefire, with Iran's nuclear program partially degraded and Iran's proxies significantly weakened. The June 2025 conflict looked at the time like a contained episode. What it actually was, a proving ground. Both sides came away with lessons. The coalition concluded that Iran could be struck harder with less Iranian retaliation than feared. Iran concluded that its proxies were more degraded than it wanted to admit, and that a direct existential conflict was a genuine possibility. Both sides adjusted. February 28th was the result. The second reference point is the 1988 USS Vincennes incident. In the context of the earlier tanker war, a U.S. warship operating in the Persian Gulf shot down an Iranian civilian airliner, killing 290 people. The U.S. described it as a tragic mistake. Iran described it as deliberate murder. But what matters for today's parallel is this. That incident did not escalate into a wider war. It contributed instead to Iran's decision to accept a ceasefire in the Iran-Iraq war. The lesson analysts draw is that Iran makes decisions based on survival calculus, not pure revenge logic. When survival is at stake, de-escalation is possible, but only when Iran can frame it internally as strength rather than submission. Today, the question is whether any outcome exists that Iran's new leadership could frame as strength. We outlasted a 12-day campaign as a frame Iran used in 2025. After 11 days of a far more intense campaign with the supreme leader killed, that frame is much harder to construct. A moderate successor might have sought a face-saving exit. Mojtaba Khamenei, by background and by the political pressure on him, almost certainly cannot. History doesn't repeat, but the patterns of miscalculation do. And right now, the pattern is loud. This is not prediction. This is conditional logic, the framework analysts use to watch conflicts that could go in multiple directions. The first development to watch is the Strait of Hormuz shipping status. If tanker traffic resumes within the next 7 to 10 days, even partially, it signals that Iran's maritime warfare capacity is being degraded by U.S. naval operations and that global energy markets can begin to stabilize. If the strait remains at near zero traffic beyond 2 weeks, the IEA emergency reserve release will be tested, oil will likely climb back toward $100, and the economic pressure on the U.S. to find an off-ramp will intensify significantly. The second is whether China makes a move. Iran is allowing Chinese vessels to transit the strait. That is a signal from Tehran to Beijing, we need you. If China responds by applying quiet pressure on Iran toward some form of pause or negotiation, perhaps via a third-party channel through Oman, which has historically served as a back channel, that would be the most consequential diplomatic development of the conflict. Watch China's foreign ministry statements, UN vote patterns, and any reports of Omani diplomatic activity. The third is the internal coherence of Iran's new leadership. Mojtaba Khamenei was named supreme leader within days of the conflict beginning. The Assembly of Experts, the clerical body that normally validates such appointments, went through an accelerated process under extraordinary circumstances. Whether the new supreme leader consolidates control over the IRGC, or whether competing factions operate with partial autonomy, will determine whether Iran's conflict decisions become more or less predictable. If Iran successfully strikes a Saudi oil facility or a U.S. carrier group asset, expect oil to surge toward $130 to $150, a formal U.S. declaration of a wider military campaign, and significant NATO alliance pressure to define collective defense obligations. If a NATO member state suffers significant casualties from Iranian fire, Article 5 consultations become unavoidable. If China begins applying economic pressure on Iran and the IEA reserve release stabilizes energy markets, Washington faces reduced public urgency and may create space for a Qatari or Omani mediation channel. This requires both sides to accept a face-saving narrative, enormously difficult given current rhetoric, but not structurally impossible. The wild card is Iran demonstrating, or credibly threatening to demonstrate, that it retains functional nuclear enrichment capability. That would not be a military escalation. It would be a signaling move. but it would fundamentally reframe the conflict's strategic stakes. The single signal to watch above all others in the next 7 days, whether any ship, not Iranian, not Chinese, successfully transits the Strait of Hormuz. If that happens, Iran's interdiction capacity is breaking down. If no commercial ship transits for another week, the economic and humanitarian pressure on the global system starts to compound in ways that become very difficult to reverse. Here's why you cannot afford to watch this from a distance. Every dollar a barrel that Brent crude stays above $80 means roughly 2 to 3 cents added to the average American gallon of gas. Gas prices have already risen nearly 50 cents in 11 days. If this conflict extends beyond 30 days with the strait effectively closed, energy analysts are warning of oil prices above $100 becoming sustained. Not a spike, but a new floor. That translates to energy inflation across everything: manufacturing costs, food transport, plastics, chemicals. The inflation that Americans just spent 3 years recovering from has a direct reignition path running through the Strait of Hormuz. 7 U.S. soldiers are dead. The U.S. is spending, by some estimates, close to $900 million per day on this operation. The administration has described it as a short-term excursion. Day 11 says otherwise. And then there's the strategic question most Americans aren't asking yet: what comes after Iran's current government? The stated U.S.-Israeli goal is regime change. But Iran is a nation of 90 million people with deeply entrenched revolutionary institutions, a new supreme leader who has strong revolutionary credentials, and a population that, whatever its frustrations with its government, has watched its supreme leader killed by foreign strikes. Regime change wars have a consistent historical record. The question of what replaces the current Iranian government is as important as whether the current one falls, and that question is receiving almost no serious public discussion in the United States. The people who understand geopolitics aren't the ones who follow the loudest voices. They're the ones who understand what the signals mean before the headlines catch up, who know why a closed strait matters more than a single missile exchange, why a succession appointment matters more than a battlefield strike, and why the conversations not being had in public are sometimes the most important ones. Every week, when the world changes faster than the news can explain, this is where that gap gets filled. The world doesn't get simpler, but the people who understand it clearly are never powerless. They're just better prepared. Here's something that hasn't gotten enough attention yet. Iran reportedly conditioned passage through the Strait of Hormuz on vessel nationality, allowing Chinese-flagged ships through while blocking all others. That is not just a maritime tactic. That is Iran publicly drawing a line between which great power it sees as an adversary and which it sees as a potential lifeline. If that holds, it means every additional week of this conflict deepens a geopolitical fault line between a US-led coalition and a China-Iran alignment that will outlast whatever ceasefire eventually comes. What we're watching in the next 7 days. Whether any third-party mediation, Oman, China, or an institution we haven't heard from yet, makes a verified move. That's the signal. This is Day 11. We'll be back when the map changes.